Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day fall away like autumn leaves. Tonight, we're traveling back to a summer evening in 1919. The Great War has ended. The world is trying to remember what peace feels like. And in the English countryside, just outside the city of Leicester, the hedgerows are thick with green, the air is warm, and the sky is taking on that particular golden quality that comes just before sunset. We're going to walk slowly through this story. There's no rush, no sudden movements, just a gentle unfolding of events that happened more than a century ago, in a time when bicycles were the way people moved through the world, when the countryside was truly quiet, and when a simple ride down a country lane could change everything. This is the story of Bella Wright, a young woman of 21, a factory worker who loved her bicycle, who had survived the war years, who had hopes and plans and a whole life ahead of her. And this is also the story of a green bicycle, an unusual shade of green, pea green they called it, the kind of color you couldn't forget once you'd seen it. On the evening of July 5th, 1919, these two stories came together on a quiet road near the village of Little Stretton. And what happened that night would become one of Britain's most debated mysteries, a case that remains, even now, officially unsolved. Which part of the city are you watching from, and what time it is at this moment? Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. So settle deeper into your pillow. Let your shoulders relax. Your breathing slow. We have all the time in the world to walk these country lanes together, to understand the world Bella lived in, and to explore what happened on that long summer evening when the light was golden and the shadows were growing long. To understand what happened to Bella Wright, we must first understand her world. The year 1919 was a year of transition, a year caught between war and peace. The Great War had ended on November 11th, 1918. The armistice had been signed. The guns had fallen silent, but Britain was still recovering, still adjusting to this strange new peace. Young men were coming home or not coming home. Women who had worked in factories and offices during the war were trying to figure out where they fit now that the men had returned. Leicestershire, in the heart of England, was a county of contrasts. Leicester itself was an industrial city, known for its hosiery and footwear manufacturing. But just a few miles outside the city, the countryside remained largely unchanged. Small villages with stone churches, farms where life moved with the seasons, country lanes that wound between hedgerows and fields. Stoughton was one of these villages, lying about 4 miles east of Leicester, in that transitional space between city and true countryside. In 1919, it was a farming community. The land around it had once belonged to Leicester Abbey, centuries before, and had been transformed into an extensive estate of thousands of acres. Life in villages like Stoughton moved slowly. Most people knew each other. The Church of St. Mary and All Saints stood at the heart of the community. There was no electricity in most homes, no motor cars on most days, just the rhythm of agricultural life, the sound of horses' hooves, and the sight of bicycles carrying people from place to place. Bicycles, they were everywhere in 1919. For working people, they were liberation. They meant you could live in a village and work in the city. They meant independence, mobility, freedom. Young women especially had embraced cycling. During the war years, women had gained new freedoms, new confidence. They rode their bicycles to work, to visit friends, to run errands. It was perfectly ordinary to see a young woman cycling alone along a country road. And then there was the war's aftermath. So many men had been damaged by what they'd seen in France and Belgium. Shell shock, they called it. What we might now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had been officers and gentlemen before the war, who came back with something broken inside them. The nightmares, the sudden rages, the inability to settle back into civilian life. This was the world into which our story unfolds. A world trying to be normal again, but still carrying the weight of 4 years of horror. Take another slow breath. Feel yourself sinking deeper into rest. The story is beginning to take shape, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Annie Bella Wright was born on July 14th, 1897, in the Leicestershire countryside. She was the eldest of 7 children. Her father was an agricultural laborer, unable to read or write. The family lived in a thatched cottage in Stoughton, that village we've been imagining. It wasn't an easy life, but it was the life she knew. Bella attended school until she was 12, then began work as a domestic servant. But during the war, like so many young women, she found better-paying work. She got a job at Bates and Company's St. Mary's Mills, a rubber factory in Leicester, about 5 miles from her home. Every day, she would ride her bicycle those 5 miles into the city, work her shift, and ride home again. People who knew Bella described her as attractive, well-liked, of good character. She was engaged to be married to a Royal Navy stoker named Archie Ward, who was waiting to be demobilized and come home from the service. They were planning their future together, but there were hints of other complications. Bella had told her mother about an officer who had fallen in love with her. We don't know who this officer was, or if he was real, or if he would matter to what happened next. Saturday, July 5th, 1919, began as an ordinary summer day. Bella had been working the night shift. She arrived home at about 8:30 in the morning and went to bed. The cottage would have been warm, the summer sun already heating the thatched roof. She slept through the heat of the day. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she rose and spent about half an hour writing letters to friends. One of those letters was to Archie, her fiancé. Just an ordinary letter. The kind of letter that gets written and sent and forgotten, except that this one would be the last she would ever write. At some point that afternoon, Bella decided to visit her uncle, George Measures, who lived in the village of Galby, about 8 miles away. She changed into a light-colored dress. She put on her hat. She wheeled her bicycle out of the cottage. The evening was beautiful, warm but not too hot. The kind of summer evening that makes you want to be outside, moving through the golden light. Bella cycled through Stoughton, past the church, out onto the country roads that wound between fields of growing crops. The roads were quiet. This was before motor cars had become common. You might see a horse and cart. You might pass other cyclists. Mostly, though, you rode through a landscape of bird song and rustling leaves and your own thoughts. Bella arrived at her uncle's cottage around 6:30 or 6:45 in the evening. She spent perhaps half an hour visiting with him. They talked about ordinary things. He showed her a white bird his children had found. She admired it. Then she said she needed to start heading home. The light was beginning to fade, and she had those 8 miles to cycle back to Stoughton. She wheeled her bicycle back out onto Galby Lane and began to ride. And somewhere along that road, on that beautiful summer evening, something went terribly wrong. Let your breathing slow. Your eyelids are heavy. The story continues, but you're safe here, far from that long ago evening. The exact sequence of events will forever be somewhat unclear, but we can piece together what witnesses saw, what they remembered, what they told the police in the days and weeks that followed. At around 6:45 in the evening, near the crossroads where Galby Lane meets Houghton Lane, a man on a distinctive green bicycle approached a young woman who was having trouble with her bicycle. The woman was Bella. Her bicycle's freewheel was loose. She was bent over trying to fix it when the man rode up. He asked if she needed help. She asked if he had a spanner. He didn't, but he did what he could to help tighten the mechanism. They got talking, as strangers do when they meet on a quiet road. She told him where she was going. He said he was heading in the same direction toward Leicester. Would she like company for part of the ride? She said yes. Multiple people saw them together that evening. Farmer, some children, people working in their gardens. And what they all remembered, what made the man distinctive, was his bicycle. That unusual pea green color, the peculiar handlebars. It wasn't the kind of bicycle you forgot. The man himself was described as being in his 30s, of medium height, between 5'7" and 5'9". He wore a gray suit, a gray cap, collar and tie, black boots. He had a broad face. He looked respectable, like a schoolteacher or a clerk, not the kind of person who would cause alarm. Bella and the green bicycle man rode together for some miles. They were seen near the hamlet of Little Stretton. They rode past a row of cottages. People saw them and thought nothing of it. Just two cyclists keeping each other company on an evening ride. And then, around 9 o'clock, as the summer twilight was deepening into dusk, a farmer named Joseph Cowell was walking along Gartree Road near Little Stretton. This was a quiet stretch of road, bordered by fields and hedgerows. The last of the day's light was fading. At 9:20 in the evening, Cowell came upon an overturned bicycle lying in the road, and beside it a figure, a woman, lying motionless on the ground. He called for help. The local doctor was summoned. Police Constable Alfred Hall arrived. By candlelight, they examined the scene. The woman was dead. At first, they thought it might have been an accident. Perhaps she had fallen from her bicycle and struck her head. These things happened. The roads were rough. A wheel could catch in a rut. Perhaps she had simply been unlucky. But the next morning, when Constable Hall returned to the church where Bella's body had been moved, he examined her more carefully and discovered a bullet wound to her head. A small wound, easy to miss in the darkness and confusion of the night before. This was no accident. This was murder. Constable Hall returned to the place where Bella had been found. He searched the area carefully, and there, in the road, he found it. A .45 caliber bullet. Someone had shot Bella right in the head. Once, a single shot. There were no signs of struggle. Her clothing was undisturbed. Her belongings were untouched. Nothing had been stolen. There had been no assault. Just a bullet, fired at close range, ending her life as she rode her bicycle down a quiet country road. The investigation began immediately. Who had done this? And why? And most urgently, where was the man with the green bicycle? Your eyes are closed now. Your body completely relaxed. Let the story carry you gently towards sleep. The murder of Bella Wright shocked the community. This wasn't London. This wasn't a rough neighborhood where violence might be expected. This was the Leicestershire countryside, where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, where a young woman should be able to cycle home safely on a summer evening. An inquest was held, and it returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. The police began their investigation in earnest. They interviewed everyone who had seen Bella that day. They spoke to her uncle, to the witnesses who had seen her riding with the man on the green bicycle. And from these interviews, they built up a detailed description of the mysterious cyclist. The Chief Constable of Leicestershire Police issued appeals in both local and national newspapers, urging the man to come forward and assist with their inquiries. After all, he might be an innocent witness. He might have important information. Perhaps he had left Bella on the road, alive and well, and someone else had come along later. Come forward, the police urged. Help us understand what happened. But the man with the green bicycle didn't come forward. Days passed, then weeks. The appeals grew more urgent. The police checked premises where bicycles were bought, sold, or repaired, looking for that distinctive green bicycle. Nothing. The man had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The investigation began to cool. Without the green bicycle man, without any physical evidence beyond that single bullet, the police had nowhere to go. The case remained open, but the trail had gone cold. And then the seasons changed. Summer faded into autumn, autumn into winter. The leaves fell from the hedgerows. The countryside turned brown and gray. The days grew short and dark. In the city of Leicester, on Highfield Street, lived a woman named Mrs. Light and her son Ronald. Ronald Light was 33 years old. He had been a mathematics teacher before the war. He had served as an officer, a captain in the Royal Engineers. But the war had not been kind to Ronald Light. He had been court-martialed in 1917 for forging move orders. He had been demoted, sent back to serve in the ranks. And then the war itself had broken him. He was classified as suffering from severe shell shock and partial deafness, and was sent back to England for psychiatric treatment. Light was demobilized in January 1919. He later claimed to have been sent home a broken man. He lived with his mother, recovering, trying to find his way back to some kind of normal life. And he owned a bicycle, an unusual bicycle, with a distinctive pea green frame. Did Ronald Light read the newspaper appeals about the Bella Wright case? We know he did. He later claimed not to have known about Wright's death until he read a Leicester Mercury article on July 8th, 3 days after the murder. According to what he would later testify, he realized immediately that he was in a terrible position. He had been the man with the green bicycle. He had been with Bella Wright that evening, and now she was dead, and the police were looking for him. But he didn't come forward. He worried over the matter but decided to do nothing beyond moving his bicycle from where he normally stored it to the attic. He claimed he failed to come forward to avoid worrying his ailing mother, and so the months continued to pass. September, October, the case grew colder. In October, Ronald Light made a decision. Late one evening, he took his bicycle from the attic and filed the serial numbers from the frame. Then he went to Upperton Road Bridge in Leicester, where he dismantled the bicycle piece by piece and threw each section into the River Soar. Every part of it. The frame, the wheels, the handlebars. Well, almost every part. He kept the rear wheel with its distinctive coaster brake. Why? We don't know. Perhaps as a souvenir. Perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to throw away everything. A laborer named Samuel Holland, walking to his night shift at a nearby mill, saw a man on the bridge, dismantling something and throwing it into the dark water below. But he didn't report it at the time. Why would he? It was just a man disposing of an old bicycle. Nothing suspicious about that. Light must have felt relief. The bicycle was gone. The main evidence that could connect him to Bella Wright was at the bottom of the river. He could move on with his life. He applied for and received a position as a mathematics teacher at a school in Cheltenham, away from Leicester, away from the scene of the crime. Months passed. The case remained unsolved, and Ronald Light began to believe he had gotten away with it. But rivers, as it turns out, give up their secrets. Breathe slowly, in and out. Your body is completely at rest now. The story unfolds like a gentle dream. On February 23, 1920, nearly 8 months after Bella's death, a barge owned by Enoch Whitehouse was being pulled along a Leicester canal by a horse. The canal was connected to the River Soar, part of that network of waterways that had once been the lifeblood of English commerce. The tow rope that pulled the barge suddenly snagged on something heavy resting on the bottom of the canal. Whitehouse stopped. They investigated. And there, dragged up from the murky water, was the frame of a bicycle. A green bicycle. The police were called. The area was searched more thoroughly. More pieces of the bicycle were recovered. Despite being dismantled, despite having the serial numbers filed off, the police were able to identify the bicycle. It had been manufactured by the BSA company, and through patient detective work, they traced it to its owner, Ronald Arthur Light, mathematics teacher, former Army captain, resident of Highfield Street, Leicester. And when the police searched the same stretch of canal more thoroughly, they found something else. An Army-issued pistol holster and .45 caliber bullets, matching the bullet found at the scene of the crime. On March 4, 1920, Ronald Light was arrested and charged with the murder of Annie Bella Wright. The story exploded into the national newspapers. The green bicycle case, they called it. It had everything. A beautiful young victim, a mysterious murder, a soldier with a troubled past, a bicycle at the bottom of a river. The public was fascinated. Light was brought before magistrates. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming. He had been with Bella on the evening she died. He had fled the scene without reporting her death. He had concealed his bicycle. He had disposed of it in a canal along with a gun holster and bullets that matched the murder weapon. His behavior was that of a guilty man. But Ronald Light maintained his innocence. He admitted, yes, he had been with Bella that evening. Yes, he had helped her with her bicycle. Yes, he had ridden with her for some miles. But he insisted that they had parted ways before Little Stretton. He had turned off toward Leicester, he said, and she had continued on toward Stoughton. He had left her alive and well. As for the bicycle, the holster, the bullets, yes, they were his, but that didn't mean he had killed anyone. The case went to trial, and Ronald Light hired the most famous defense barrister in England, Sir Edward Marshall Hall. Marshall Hall was legendary. He was known as the Great Defender, a man who had won acquittals in some of the most hopeless-looking murder cases. He was famous for his theatrical courtroom style, his emotional oratory, his ability to manipulate juries. But for the Green Bicycle case, Marshall Hall abandoned his usual emotional style in favor of a more technical and calculated approach. He knew that the evidence against Light looked damning. He needed to create reasonable doubt. He needed to show that the circumstantial evidence could be explained in ways other than guilt. The trial began on June 9, 1920, at Leicester Castle. The historic courthouse, with its great hall and ancient stones, became the stage for one of the most famous trials of the era. Let your mind drift now. The courtroom is far away, fading into history. Your breathing is slow and steady. Durand Eastman Elementary School. Her friends and family remember her as sweet, soft-spoken, gentle. She loved playing with friends. She loved her family. She was, in every way, an ordinary 11-year-old girl. November 26, 1973, had not been a good day for Michelle. She had been teased at school, bullied by her classmates. It was the kind of everyday cruelty that children inflict on each other, thoughtless and casual but painful nonetheless. Michelle came home from school that Monday afternoon feeling hurt and upset. A few days earlier, Michelle's mother had misplaced her purse at a shopping plaza near the school. That afternoon, around 3:20, Michelle's classmates watched as she left school and headed toward the plaza to retrieve her mother's purse. She crossed the street. She walked in the direction of the shopping center. She never came home. Her mother, Carolyn Manza, reported her missing that evening when Michelle failed to return. The police responded immediately. By now, after Carmen and Wanda, they knew to take such disappearances seriously. The search began right away. 2 days later, on November 28th, a police officer discovered Michelle's body along Route 350 in Macedon, a rural area east of Rochester. The location was remote, accessible by rural highways. Michelle, like the others, had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled from behind. Her body had been either thrown or placed at the roadside. The police now had no doubt. They were dealing with a serial predator. Someone who targeted young girls, specifically girls aged 10 or 11. Someone who operated in the Rochester area. And someone who appeared to be selecting victims based on a pattern. Carmen Colon, found in Churchville. Wanda Volkovich, found in Webster. Michelle Manza, found in Macedon. The matching initials, the matching towns, could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The media seized on the pattern. They called it the alphabet murders, the double initial murders, the ABC killings. The public was terrified. Parents with daughters whose first and last names began with the same letter were especially frightened. Some kept their children home from school. Others refused to let their daughters out of sight. The trust that had characterized these working-class neighborhoods evaporated. Michelle's funeral was held on December 1st at Corpus Christi Church. An open casket service. Scores of mourners attended. At the conclusion of the service, Michelle's father, Christopher Manza, made a statement that would stay with those who heard it. "She was a sweet little girl," he said. "She didn't fight much." That phrase, "she didn't fight much," has been interpreted in different ways. Was he simply saying that Michelle was gentle, non-confrontational? Or was he commenting on something about her death, perhaps trying to find some small comfort in the hope that she hadn't suffered long? We'll never know exactly what he meant, but the sadness in those words is unmistakable. Michelle was laid to rest at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, the same cemetery where Carmen and Wanda lay. 3 girls, 3 graves, 3 graves, 3 families destroyed by grief. And still, the killer had not been found. Your body is completely relaxed now, your mind drifting. Let the story wash over you like gentle waves. The investigation into the alphabet murders became one of the largest in Rochester's history. The police were under enormous pressure. The community was frightened. The media coverage was intense. And yet, despite the massive effort, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. Captain Andrew Sparacino of the Rochester Police Department was asked if he believed the same person had killed all 3 girls. "I am not convinced," he said, "but I strongly suspect we're looking for the same person." That caveat, "I am not convinced," was significant, because even then, there were differences between the cases. Carmen's murder differed from Wanda's and Michelle's in important ways. Carmen had been strangled from the front, face to face with her attacker. Wanda and Michelle had been strangled from behind. Behavioral profilers would later point out that these are psychologically very different acts. Strangulation from the front requires the killer to look at the victim's face, to see their fear and pain. Strangulation from behind allows the killer to avoid that confrontation. It's rare for a single killer to use both methods. There were other differences, too. Carmen had been seen running along the expressway, suggesting she had escaped and was trying to get help. There were reports of 2 adults being with Carmen. The circumstances of her abduction seemed different from the others. Some investigators began to suspect that Carmen's murder might have been committed by a different person than whoever killed Wanda and Michelle. Perhaps a family member, perhaps someone she knew. While Wanda and Michelle appeared to have been opportunistic abductions by a stranger or predator who was watching for vulnerable girls. But if it was 2 different killers, what about the alphabet pattern? Was it really just coincidence that all 3 girls had matching initials and were found in towns with those same initials? Some experts think yes. In the Rochester area at that time, alliterative names were actually quite common. This was the era of Marilyn Monroe and Bridget Bardot. Parents liked the sound of matching initials, and many of the surrounding towns had names starting with common letters: Webster, Walworth, Williamson, Churchville, Macedon. It might have been nothing more than a tragic coincidence, amplified by media attention and public fear. The police investigated numerous suspects. Early on, they looked at Carmen's uncle, Miguel Colon. They investigated a firefighter named Dennis Termini, who turned out to be a serial rapist. When police came to arrest him, Termini shot himself in the head. They looked at Kenneth Bianchi, who would later become infamous as one of the Hillside Stranglers in California. Bianchi had lived in Rochester during the time of the murders. He had worked as an ice cream vendor, which gave him access to children. But there was never any concrete evidence linking him to the Alphabet murders. In 2011, police investigated a man named Joseph Naso, who had lived in Rochester in the early 70s and who was later convicted of murdering 6 women in California, 4 of whom had alliterative names. But DNA testing ruled him out as a suspect in Wanda's murder. Years later, a Rochester man was identified as a possible suspect. He had been jailed in 1987 for raping an 11-year-old girl in 1986. He matched the general profile. He had opportunity, but without physical evidence, without a confession, there was no way to prove anything. The physical evidence from Carmen's and Michelle's cases was eventually lost or destroyed. Only the evidence from Wanda's murder was preserved. That evidence, those biological samples, remain the best hope for eventually solving at least part of the Alphabet murders. The investigation generated thousands of leads. The police followed up on everyone they could. They erected billboards. They offered rewards. They conducted televised reconstructions of the crimes. Over 200 calls came in from the public, but none of it led to an arrest. And slowly, over time, the active investigation wound down. The case remained open, but without new leads, there was nowhere to go. Breathe deeply. Let your jaw relax. Your shoulders drop. The story is moving toward its conclusion. The Alphabet murders changed Rochester. They changed how the community thought about safety, about childhood, about trust. Parents became more protective. Children were taught to be wary of strangers, to never get in a car with someone they didn't know, to stay in groups. The freedom that had characterized childhood in the early 70s began to erode, replaced by fear and caution. The case also changed how law enforcement handled missing children investigations. The immediate response to Michelle's disappearance, the recognition that time was critical, became the model for how such cases should be handled. The idea that the first hours after a child goes missing are crucial became standard practice. But for the families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle, The changes in policy and practice were cold comfort. Their daughters were gone. The person or persons who took them were never brought to justice. In 1991, Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle and longtime suspect, died by suicide after a domestic dispute. He never confessed to anything. He never provided answers. His death simply closed off one potential avenue to the truth. In 1995, Carmen's mother made her first public statement about her daughter's murder. She had been silent for nearly 25 years. What she said, we don't fully know. But the pain of losing a child, of never having justice, of living with unanswered questions for a quarter century, must have been almost unbearable. Today, more than 50 years after the murders, the case remains officially unsolved. The Rochester Police Department still maintains the investigation as open. They still accept tips. They still hope that someday, perhaps through advances in DNA technology, perhaps through a deathbed confession, perhaps through some piece of evidence that was overlooked, they might finally have answers. The debate continues among investigators and true crime researchers. Were all three murders committed by the same person? Or were they committed by two different killers? Was the alphabet pattern meaningful? Or was it just coincidence seized upon by the media? True crime writer Michael Benson, who wrote extensively about the case, believes Wanda and Michelle were killed by the same person, but that Carmen's murder was different. He points to the different methods, the different circumstances, the different details of the crimes. Others believe all three were connected, that a single predator stalked Rochester streets in the early 70s, selecting victims based on some criteria we don't understand, following a pattern that made sense only to him. We may never know the truth, and perhaps, in some ways, the identity of the killer matters less than the memory of the victims. Carmen Colon was 10 years old. She loved her family. She was doing an errand for her mother when she was taken. Wanda Volkovich was 11 years old. She was responsible and helpful. She was buying groceries for her family when she disappeared. Michelle Maenza was 11 years old. She was sweet and gentle. She was retrieving her mother's purse when she never came home. 3 girls, 3 lives cut short, 3 families forever changed, 3 communities traumatized. The streets they walked are still there. The neighborhoods where they lived have changed, but they remain. Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, where all 3 are buried, is still peaceful and green. And on certain days, people still visit their graves, leaving flowers, saying prayers, remembering. Let your breathing slow even more. Your mind is quiet now. The story is nearly complete. Rochester has changed since the early 1970s. The industrial base has shifted. Kodak, once the city's greatest employer, has declined. New industries have emerged. The population has changed. The neighborhoods have evolved. But the memory of the alphabet murders remains. It's part of Rochester's history now, a dark chapter that the city has never quite been able to close. Parents who lived through that time still remember. They remember the fear. They remember keeping their daughters close. They remember the names, Carmen, Wanda, Michelle, and they tell their own children and grandchildren about what happened, as a warning, as a lesson, as a memorial. The case has been featured in books, documentaries, true crime podcasts. Each new generation discovers the story and wonders. Who did this? Will it ever be solved? Could it happen again? The answer to that last question is yes. Predators still exist. Children are still vulnerable, but we are also more aware now, more vigilant, more prepared. The systems for finding missing children are better. The technology for solving crimes is more advanced. If the alphabet murders happened today, there would be Amber Alerts, security cameras, cell phone tracking, DNA databases. The killer would have a much harder time escaping justice. But in the early 70s, none of that existed, and 3 girls died because of it. So as you drift now into sleep, remember them. Not as victims, not as statistics in an unsolved case, but as children who lived, who played and laughed and loved their families, who had hopes and dreams and whole lives ahead of them. Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, Michelle Maenza. Say their names. Remember they were real. Remember they mattered. Remember, they still matter. The case may never be solved. The person or persons responsible may have died years ago, taking the truth with them. Or they may still be alive, carrying their terrible secret. We don't know, but we do know this. These 3 girls deserved better. They deserved to grow up, to graduate from school, to fall in love, to have families of their own, to grow old. They didn't get that chance. But we can give them something else. We can remember them. We can honor their memory. We can ensure that they are not forgotten. And so, as you sleep tonight, let them rest too. Let them be at peace. Let their stories settle into history, where they belong, alongside all the other stories of lives lost too soon. The investigation continues. The case remains open. Hope persists that someday, somehow, there will be justice. But for now, for tonight, there is only rest, only quiet, only the gentle darkness of sleep. Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle, 3 girls from Rochester, 3 lights that went out too soon. But lights that still shine in memory, in remembrance, in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Sleep now, sleep peacefully. The story is told. The names are remembered, and that, perhaps, is all we can do. Good night. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward. They called witnesses who had seen Bella Wright riding with a man on a green bicycle. They presented the bicycle itself, pulled from the canal. They showed the holster and bullets. They described Light's suspicious behavior, his failure to come forward, his attempt to destroy evidence. The motive, they suggested, was that Bella had rejected Light's advances. She had tried to escape. He had pulled out his service revolver and shot her. It was a crime of opportunity, fueled by rejection and rage. But Marshall Hall persuaded Light to admit to being with Wright, to admit ownership of a revolver, and to admit that the holster found in the river was his. This was a calculated risk. Instead of denying everything, Light would admit the facts that couldn't be denied, and then explain them in a way consistent with innocence. Yes, Light testified he had been with Bella that evening, but their meeting had been completely innocent. He had helped her with her bicycle. They had ridden together for a while, keeping each other company. Then they had parted ways. He had turned toward Lester. She had continued toward home. That was the last he saw of her. He hadn't come forward because he was afraid. His mother was ill. He didn't want to worry her. And he knew how bad it would look, his being the last person to see Bella alive. So he had made the terrible decision to remain silent and hope the matter would blow over. As for the gun and bullets, yes, he had owned a revolver during his military service. And yes, those bullets in the holster were his. But he had never fired the gun at Bella. He had disposed of the bicycle and holster because he feared being implicated in something he hadn't done. Marshall Hall then went on the attack. He challenged the prosecution's theory. Where was the murder weapon? It had never been found. The police had only a holster and bullets, not the gun itself. And then Marshall Hall presented his masterstroke. He suggested an alternative theory, that Bella had been shot by accident, perhaps by someone shooting at birds from a distance. He pointed to the dead crow that had been found near Bella's body. What if someone had been out shooting crows or rabbits? What if they had fired across the field, the bullet passing through the bird and striking Bella as she cycled past? Marshall Hall's comprehensive knowledge of firearms helped him present a credible alternative account. The bullet could have come from a rifle just as easily as from a revolver. The angle of the wound was consistent with a shot from some distance. And crucially, Bella had shown no signs of struggle. Her face powder was still undisturbed. If Light had confronted her, pointed a gun at her, wouldn't there have been some sign of distress? The prosecution fought back. The theory was far-fetched, they argued, too coincidental. And what about Light's behavior? His lies, his disposal of evidence? These were the actions of a guilty man. But Marshall Hall had planted seeds of doubt. In English law, a defendant must be proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. If the jury had any reasonable doubt about Light's guilt, they must acquit. The jury retired to consider their verdict. The public waited. The newspapers speculated. After just over 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: not guilty. Ronald Light was free to go. Your breathing is so slow now, so peaceful. The story is almost complete. Ronald Light walked out of Leicester Castle a free man. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some believed justice had been done, that an innocent man had been saved from the gallows. Others believed a clever defense lawyer had allowed a murderer to escape. Light went on to live a quiet life. He never spoke publicly about the case again. He died in 1975, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Did Ronald Light kill Bella Wright? We will never know for certain. The evidence was circumstantial. The murder weapon was never found. The motive was unclear. Marshall Hall's alternative theory, while unlikely, was not impossible. Some believe Light was guilty. The circumstantial evidence was strong. His behavior was suspicious. Perhaps his shell shock had left him unstable, capable of sudden violence. Perhaps Bella had sensed something wrong and tried to escape, and he had reacted in rage. Others believe he was innocent. Perhaps, as Marshall Hall suggested, Bella was struck by a stray bullet from someone shooting at birds. Perhaps Light panicked when he realized he would be suspected, and made the terrible decision to hide his involvement. Perhaps he was simply a damaged man who made bad choices, but not a murderer. The case remains officially unsolved. Leicester still commemorates the story with annual cycle rides that retrace Bella's last journey. The green bicycle itself hung for years in a shop in Evington, though its current location is unknown. What we know for certain is this. On a beautiful summer evening in 1919, a young woman named Bella Wright set out on her bicycle to visit her uncle. She never made it home. She died on a quiet country road, shot once in the head, for reasons we can only guess at. Bella Wright was just 21 years old. She had survived the war years, had plans to marry, had a future ahead of her. All of that ended on a summer evening in Leicestershire. And somewhere in the fading light, a green bicycle carried someone away from the scene. Whether that person was a murderer or simply an unlucky witness, we will never know. The hedgerows where Bella died are still there. The roads she cycled are still there, though much changed. The church where she's buried still stands in Stoughton Village. And on summer evenings, when the light is golden and the shadows grow long, you can almost imagine you see her still, cycling through the countryside she loved, forever young, forever free. Let yourself drift now. The story is told. The mystery remains, as mysteries sometimes must. But you are safe, warm, far from those long ago events. The summer evening fades. The green bicycle disappears into history, and you at last can rest. Sleep well, sleep peacefully. The past is past. The night is gentle, and tomorrow will bring its own light. Good night. Story 2. Close your eyes. Take a slow breath. Let the tension fall from your shoulders like snow sliding from winter branches. Tonight, we're traveling to upstate New York, to a city that sits on the banks of the Genesee River, where waterfalls once powered flour mills and where, in the early 1970s, 3 young girls lost their lives in circumstances that would haunt a community for generations. Rochester, New York, the Flower City, home to Eastman Kodak, Bosch and Lohm, Xerox. A city of industry and immigrants, of working-class neighborhoods where children played in the streets and mothers sent their daughters to the corner store without fear. A place where life moved with the rhythm of factory shifts and church bells, where everyone knew their neighbors, where doors were often left unlocked. But in the space of 2 years, from 1971 to 1973, something changed. 3 girls disappeared from these familiar streets. Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, Michelle Maenza. Their first and last names began with the same letter. Their bodies were found in towns that shared those initials. And a pattern emerged that would become known as the Alphabet Murders. This is their story. Not a story of horror, though horror was certainly present, but a story of 3 children who lived and laughed and had hopes, who existed in a particular time and place, and whose brief lives deserve to be remembered with gentleness and respect. So settle deeper into your pillow. Let your breathing slow. We're going to walk through this history together, softly, carefully, honoring these three girls and the community that lost them. There's no need to tense. Just listen. Just drift. The story will carry you gently towards sleep. To understand what happened in Rochester, we must first understand Rochester itself. The city in the early 1970s was a place caught between prosperity and decline, between hope and hardship. Rochester had been built on water power. The Genesee River, with its 100-foot waterfall in the heart of downtown, had powered the flour mills that gave the city its first nickname, the Flour City. Later came the camera industry. George Eastman had founded his photographic empire there in the 1880s, and by the 1970s, Eastman Kodak employed tens of thousands of people. Xerox had its headquarters there. Bosch and Lohm made optical equipment. The city had weathered the Great Depression better than many industrial cities. But by the early 70s, change was coming. The term Rust Belt was beginning to be applied to industrial cities around the Great Lakes. Manufacturing was starting to decline. The prosperity that had defined Rochester for generations was beginning to show cracks. The population in 1970 was around 300,000 people. The city was predominantly white, but that was changing. Rochester's black population had grown significantly since World War II, with many families migrating from the South in search of jobs and opportunity. By 1970, black residents made up perhaps 15% of the population, living primarily in certain neighborhoods where segregation, though not legally mandated, was very much a reality. The city had neighborhoods with distinct characters. The 19th Ward, with its single-family homes and working-class families. The East Side, where many of the cases we'll discuss took place, characterized by streets of modest houses, corner stores, and the constant movement of children playing. The neighborhoods where Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle lived were not wealthy, but they were communities. Places where neighbors looked out for each other, where kids rode their bikes and walked to school and ran errands for their mothers. It was a time before helicopter parenting, before milk cartons showed pictures of missing children, before cable news breathlessly covered every abduction. Children in the early 70s had a kind of freedom that would seem almost unimaginable today. They walked to school alone. They played outside until the streetlights came on. They were sent to the corner store with $1 and trusted to come home safely. The idea that a child might be taken, might be harmed by a stranger, was something that happened elsewhere. In big cities, perhaps, in rough neighborhoods, but not here, not in these working-class streets where everyone knew everyone. But that sense of safety was an illusion, and in November of 1971, that illusion began to shatter. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your body sinking deeper into the mattress. The story is beginning, but there's no need to hold tension. Just breathe, just listen. Carmen Elisa Colon was 10 years old. She lived with her mother and grandmother on Wellsback Street, on Rochester's north side. She attended school number 14, where she was in the 4th grade. Her friends and teachers remember her as a sweet child, perhaps a bit shy, but friendly and well-liked. Carmen was Puerto Rican. Her mother, who spoke limited English, worked hard to provide for her family. They lived in a neighborhood of Puerto Rican and other immigrant families, people who had come to Rochester seeking the American dream of steady work and a better life for their children. November 16, 1971, was a Tuesday, a regular autumn day in Rochester. The leaves had mostly fallen from the trees. The air had that particular crispness that comes in November, when winter is approaching but hasn't quite arrived. That afternoon, around 4:30, Carmen left her home on an errand. She needed to pick up a prescription from a pharmacy on Lyell Avenue, about 1.5 miles from her house. Her mother gave her money for the medicine and for the bus fare. Carmen set out, walking along Lyell Avenue toward the pharmacy. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing Carmen that afternoon. She was seen walking. She was seen near the pharmacy. And then, around 5 o'clock, multiple people reported seeing something strange and terrible. They saw a young girl running along what would become Interstate 490, a major expressway. She was running frantically, waving her arms. She was naked from the waist down. She appeared to be trying to flag down cars, trying to get help. She looked terrified. Approximately 100 motorists passed by that afternoon. 100 people who saw or might have seen a little girl in obvious distress. And not one of them stopped. Why? This is one of the questions that would haunt Rochester for years. Some people later said they didn't realize what they were seeing until they had already passed. You're driving on an expressway, moving at speed, and something flashes by. By the time your brain processes what your eyes saw, you're already past it. Some said they thought about calling the police when they got home. Some said they convinced themselves they must have been mistaken, that they couldn't possibly have seen what they thought they saw. This was before cell phones, before 911 was universal. To report something, you had to stop, find a phone, make a call. And perhaps, too, there was that human tendency to assume someone else would handle it. Surely someone else would stop. Surely someone else would help. But no one did. And Carmen Colon, 10 years old, terrified, running for her life, found no help on that busy road. 2 days later, on November 18th, 2 teenage boys found Carmen's body in a ditch beside a rural road in Churchville, about 10 miles west of Rochester. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. She had been dumped like garbage in that ditch. The Rochester Police Department launched an investigation. They interviewed witnesses. They tried to track down the vehicle that Carmen had apparently escaped from. Different witnesses gave different descriptions. A luxury car, possibly a Dodge or Ford, but the details were vague, contradictory. Carmen's uncle, Miguel Colon, became an early suspect. He had a criminal past. He had access to Carmen. And shortly after her murder, he left Rochester for Puerto Rico. Police questioned him multiple times but could never gather enough evidence to charge him. He would remain under suspicion for years, though he was never proven to be guilty of anything. Carmen's funeral was held on November 22nd at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. 200 mourners attended. The community grieved. Parents held their children a little tighter. But life, as it does, continued. The investigation slowly cooled. Without a clear suspect, without physical evidence that led anywhere, the case remained open but inactive. Carmen Colon became a name in a file. Tragedy, yes, but an isolated one. Except it wasn't isolated. It was only the beginning. Breathe slowly now, in and out. Let your muscles relax completely. The story continues, but you're safe in your bed, far from those events. 17 months passed. Winter turned to spring, spring to early summer. The grief over Carmen Colon hadn't been forgotten, but it had receded into memory. Life in Rochester continued its rhythms. Wanda Lee Volkovich was 11 years old. She lived with her family on Conkey Avenue on Rochester's east side, in a working-class neighborhood not far from where Carmen had lived. She attended school number 39. She was described by those who knew her as quiet, responsible, mature for her age. She often helped care for her younger siblings. She was the kind of child parents rely on, the kind who can be trusted with responsibilities. April 2nd, 1973, was a Monday. Early spring in Rochester, the weather warming but still cool. Around 5:15 in the afternoon, Wanda's mother sent her to a grocery store on Avenue D, just a few blocks from home. She needed a few items for dinner. It was the kind of ordinary errand that Wanda had done dozens of times before. Wanda walked to the store. She bought what her mother needed. A witness saw her leaving the store, carrying her bag of groceries. She was heading home. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon. Still daylight, still safe hours. Wanda never made it home. That evening, when she didn't return, her family grew worried. They searched the neighborhood. They called friends. They contacted the police. The search began immediately, but Wanda had simply vanished from those familiar streets. The next morning, April 3rd, at 10:15, a New York State trooper on patrol made a terrible discovery. At a rest area off State Route 104 in Webster, a suburb northeast of Rochester, he found Wanda's body at the bottom of a highway embankment. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled from behind. Her body showed signs that she had been killed elsewhere and then dumped at that location. The medical examiner would later determine that physical evidence had been recovered from her body, evidence that would prove crucial in future investigations. One witness reported seeing Wanda get into a brown vehicle shortly after she left the grocery store, but the description was vague. Brown car, that was all. In a city full of brown cars, it was almost useless. The Rochester Police Department recognized immediately that this case bore disturbing similarities to Carmen Colon's murder. Both girls were around the same age. Both had been abducted in the afternoon while running simple errands. Both had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Both had been found in suburban locations that began with the same letter as their names. Carmen Colon, found in Churchville. Wanda Volkovich, found in Webster. Was it coincidence, or was it pattern? The police publicly maintained that the cases might not be related. Behind the scenes, though, they were treating them as connected. A sergeant was reassigned from the Cologne case to help with the new task force investigating Wanda's murder. The investigation intensified, but they had very little to work with. No clear suspect, no reliable vehicle description, no witnesses who had seen the actual abduction. The physical evidence was limited to what had been recovered from Wanda's body, and in 1973, DNA analysis as we know it today didn't exist. Wanda was laid to rest on April 6th at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, the same cemetery where Carmen had been buried. She was buried in a small white and gold casket. The Reverend Benedict Amann officiated. The community mourned again. Parents became more protective. Children were warned to be careful, to stay in groups, to be wary of strangers. The police released public appeals for information. They set up hotlines. They followed up on hundreds of tips. But as weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. And then, 7 months later, it happened again. Let yourself drift deeper now. You're breathing slow and steady. The story continues to unfold, like pages turning in a book you're reading in that space between waking and sleep. Michelle Joan Maenza was 11 years old. She lived with her family on Weaver Street, also on Rochester's northeast side. She was in the 6th grade at